When it comes to the Old West, they don't get much more legendary than Kit Carson. Although soft-spoken and physically small, this larger-than-life mountain man would go on to become a national hero. And in death, he'd be immortalized in bronze. But who was Kit Carson really? What sort of a man was he? What was his childhood like, and what events shaped him into the legend he'd become? Was Carson a courageous hero and savior of the frontier, or simply a bloodthirsty killer and the living embodiment of manifest destiny? Or just somewhere in between? And just how short was he anyway? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Christopher Houston Carson, affectionately known as Kit, was born in Madison County, Kentucky on Christmas Eve, 1809. The family would migrate to Missouri just a year later and settle down at Boone's Lick, about halfway between St. Louis and present-day Kansas City. And yeah, Boone's Lick did derive its name from a salt spring used by the sons of famed frontiersman Daniel Boone. Indeed, the Carson and Boone families would grow rather close over time. They intermarried, worked together, and even helped each other repel attacks from the hostiles, which in Missouri in those days was still a very real threat. Hell, Kit's own father, Lindsay, had even lost a couple of digits on his left hand during a skirmish with a war party. According to Carson, quote, "For 2 or 3 years after our arrival, we had to remain forted, and it was necessary to have men stationed at the extremities of the fields for the protection of those that were laboring," end quote. Sadly, when Kit was just 8 years old, he'd lose his father to a freak accident. The elder Carson was burning timber when a widowmaker broke off and killed him. Without a primary breadwinner, this meant that Kit, his remaining siblings, and their mother, Rebecca, were effectively plunged into poverty. That being the case, young Carson had to quit school in order to help put food on the table. Years later, he'd recall, "I jumped to my rifle and threw down my spelling book, and there it lies." Now, it's unclear as to how much education Kit was actually privy to prior to him throwing down his spelling book, but it weren't much, and he would remain illiterate for the rest of his life. He'd eventually learn how to spell his own name, but that's about it. For a short time following his father's death, Kit became a ward to a neighbor family, possibly to lessen the burden on his mother with all those other young mouths to feed. It also may have had a little something to do with Kit's new stepdaddy. Rebecca remarried in 1822 when Kit was just 13, but as tends to happen, he and his stepfather did not get along. And the following year, a 14-year-old Carson was apprenticed to a saddle maker in the nearby settlement of Franklin. And to say that he absolutely hated it would have been an understatement. The only good news was that Franklin was the jumping-off point for the Santa Fe Trail. This meant that many of the customers that Kit dealt with there at the saddle shop were traders and fur trappers. A wild new breed of men that Kit was immediately drawn to. He'd get to hear of their experiences firsthand. The prairies teeming with bison and rivers so full of beaver, all a man had to do was reach in with his hands and grab them. Not to mention all them beautiful Spanish maidens down in Nuevo Mexico. Also worth noting that by 1825, at least 2 of Kit's older siblings had already made the trek west on both trading and surveying expeditions. Got to imagine that Kit heard quite a few stories from them as well. Stories of the sort that'll make a youngster feel as if they're missing out on a grand adventure. And besides, like I said, he really did not like working in that saddle shop. Carson would describe his employer, David Workman, as a good enough guy, but the job just didn't suit him. And he feared that if he stayed there in Franklin, he'd have to, quote, "pass my life in labor that was distasteful to me," end quote. Kind of reminds me of that Henry David Thoreau line about how most men live lives of quiet desperation and go to the grave with the song still in them. Well, by God, Kit Carson would go on to do many things, but living a life of quiet desperation would not be one of them. So it were at the age of 16 that Kit ran away from the saddle shop and straight into the history books, signing on as a laborer with a wagon train bound for Santa Fe. Now, this caravan followed the Arkansas River into present-day Colorado before turning left and taking the Raton Pass into Santa Fe. Would have taken anywhere from 8 to 10 weeks, and danger abounded. But to be honest, Carson's first foray west really wasn't all that bad. Worst thing that happened was some old boy accidentally shooting himself in the arm. The wound became infected, but the injured party was stubborn and refused to undergo amputation. With every bump of the wagon, he'd cry out in agony, and each passing day, those black streaks just crept further and further up his arm. Finally, the others got tired of hearing him holler, so they held him down and took to chopping. Sliced the skin with the razor blade and then proceeded to hack through the bone with an old saw. A wagon bolt was then heated in a fire till it was glowing hot and then applied to the stump. cauterizing the severed arteries. This was followed by a liberal application of axle tar, and according to Carson, the man was perfectly well by the time they arrived in New Mexico. I don't know about you, but the idea of having my arm cut off with zero anesthesia doesn't really seem all that appealing. If he was lucky, they filled him full of whiskey first, but I doubt anyone bothered to wash their hands. Now, Kit wouldn't stay long there in Santa Fe. He arrived in November of 1826, and within days, he had worked his way north to the mountain village of Taos, which at that period was the unofficial fur trading capital of the Southwest. A lot of mountain men would winter there in Taos, just spending the colder months mending their traps and drinking whiskey and cavorting with the senoritas. As luck would have it, it was there where Kit ran into an old family friend from Missouri named Matthew Kincaid. And according to some, it was under Kincaid's tutelage that Carson was first exposed to the life of a mountain man. Truth be told, though, we don't really know much of anything when it comes to Kit's first winter in New Mexico. And what's more, it does appear that he had second thoughts and even attempted to return home on at least 2 occasions. He would head east during the spring of 1827, only to turn around about halfway and hire on with another wagon train. This was repeated a few months later, and once again, Kit was only about halfway to Missouri when he made a U-turn and headed straight back to Taos. He found employment as a cook for veteran trapper Ewing Young, and by later on that spring, Kit was fluent enough in Spanish to work as a translator for a merchant caravan down in Mexico. The 1,000-mile journey went off without a hitch, followed by Carson doing a short stint as a teamster for the copper mines. His big break wouldn't come until 1829 when Ewing Young invited the then 19-year-old Carson to join his party as some 40-odd trappers headed for the Gila River in present-day Arizona. Now, Ewing Young was an interesting character in his own right. About a decade Kit's elder, he had first arrived there in the Southwest in the early 1820s. And although Taos was his base of operations, Young would spend the next several years traveling extensively across the West in search of beaver. Ah, yes, that sweet, sweet beaver. I know I've spoken on this extensively in past episodes, but just in case you're a new listener, fur, especially beaver fur, was in very high demand during the early 1800s. Hell, the first American millionaire, John Jacob Astor, earned his wealth primarily through the beaver trade, a trade fueled by fashionable high-end felt hats that were all the rage back east and in Europe. Initially, these pelts were obtained from the Native Americans, but the lucrative nature of the business soon enticed a few brave souls to venture out and begin trapping beaver all on their own. There was a very slow trickle west following the Lewis and Clark expedition, but the true era of the mountain man didn't really begin in earnest until 1822. That's when a guy named William Ashley and his partner, Andrew Henry, established the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and placed their famous ad looking for 100 enterprising young men to ascend the River Missouri to its source, there to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years. A ton of future legends got their start in 1822 with Rocky Mountain Fur, including men like Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass, and Jedediah Smith. Pretty much the same rough types that Carson had begun encountering in that saddle shop when he was still a wee lad. By the way, real quick, I'd like to give a special shout out to listener Jude, who sadly lost a good dog by the name of Tuppy recently. I've been there, man. It's never a good feeling, to say the least. I'm reminded of a quote from C.S. Lewis when he said something along the lines of, "We treat our dogs as if they were almost human, and in the end, they truly do become almost human." And yeah, sometimes that sting of losing a pet can be just as powerful as if we lost a family member. Hell, for most of us, our dogs are members of our families. So Jude, I know my words don't offer up much solace, but from everything you told me, Tuppy was about as good as they come. You were both lucky to have one another, even if but for a brief period of time. All right, let's get back to Kit Carson. Like I was saying, in August 1829, he finally got his chance to officially join the ranks of the mountain men with Ewing Young's Gila expedition. Now, just an FYI, but this particular trip, much like Carson's escape from apprenticeship, was technically against the law. Most of the beaver men who hung around Taos would head further north into the Rockies when it came time to set their traps, which the Mexican government was fine with. What they didn't appreciate, however, were these long-haired gringos trapping in Mexican waters. So, in order to pull the wool over the eyes of the authorities, Young and his men began their journey by heading to present-day Colorado. It was there, away from the prying eyes of Mexican officials, that they would make a sudden about-face and head southwest into Arizona. Per author David Roberts in his book A Newer World, quote, "Along the way, Carson mastered the laborious and dangerous craft of beaver trapping. From Ewing Young, he learned much else, such as how to go 4 days across a desert without water and survive. But of all the disciplines his teacher schooled him in, the most important, in view of Carson's subsequent fame, was the art of killing Indians. End quote. And yeah, as fate would have it, it was during this maiden expedition that a still teenage Kit Carson would receive his baptismal by fire. The party of trappers were near the head of the Salt River when they spotted a sizable war party, most likely Apache. Young directed the majority of the men to conceal themselves as best they could, thus tricking the warriors into thinking they were a smaller outfit than they truly were. And when Young invited the Apaches into camp, that's when the hidden trappers, Carson included, rose up and opened fire, dropping somewhere between 15 to 20 of them. Now, all total, this journey would take over a year and a half. From the Salt River, they struck the Colorado, taking them just south of the Grand Canyon, before pushing west across the Mojave all the way to the San Gabriel Mission, just outside of present-day Los Angeles. From there, they would push north into the Sacramento Valley, where they trapped for the remainder of the summer. And no, that fight with the Apache was not their only clash with the indigenous. Once they were safely in California, they volunteered to chase down a group of runaway natives who had been, air quotes, pacified by Spanish missionaries. Carson would later recall that the Indians were routed and lost a great number of men. We entered their village in triumph, set fire to it, and burned it to the ground. Then, on the trip home, they butted heads with yet another bunch of fighters on the banks of the Colorado. Just as it seemed that gunplay was imminent, it was discovered that one of the warriors spoke Spanish. Our very own Kit Carson then conversed with the man, and after a few heavy threats, the warriors dispersed. Guess they figured that whatever the trappers had wasn't worth the amount of men they'd lose in getting to it. Story goes that Young and his trappers hauled in around $20,000 worth of beaver pelts during this expedition, damn near $700,000 in today's money. As you can imagine, as soon as they got back to Taos during the spring of 1831, a good time was had by all. Carson would later remember that they, quote, passed the time gloriously, spending our money freely, never thinking that our lives were risked in gaining it. Our only idea was to get rid of the dross as soon as possible, but at the same time, have as much pleasure and enjoyment as the country would afford. Trappers and sailors are similar in regard to the money that they earn so dearly, daily being in danger of losing their lives. But when the voyage has been made, they think not of the hardships and danger through which they had passed, spend all they have, and are ready for another trip. End quote. Sure enough, shortly thereafter, Carson would enlist with another brigade of trappers under the leadership of Jim Bridger and Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, traveling to the lands of the Salish and the Nez Perce. According to Kit, they'd lose around 5 men that winter to the Blackfeet, and this most certainly would not be Carson's only run-in with that particular tribe. We'll be hearing much more about the Blackfeet here very shortly. Come springtime, Kit and the others would trap the waters of the Bear before pushing into present-day Colorado, just working their way south to the Arkansas River, where they'd remain for the winter of 1832. It was there in January when an uninvited party of Crow made off with around 9 of their ponies. The following day, Carson and a dozen of his fellow trappers went in pursuit, quickly locating the offending party. The mountain men bid their time, waiting until the Crow fell asleep before sneaking into camp and retrieving their stolen mounts. At which point they had to decide whether to quietly depart or stick around and exact a little revenge. They chose revenge. I think it's worth hearing this decision in Kit's own words. We then held a council, taking the views of each in regard to what had best be done. Some were in favor of retiring. Having recovered their property and received no damage, they were willing to return to camp. Not so with those who had lost no animals. They wanted satisfaction for the trouble and hardships they had gone through while in pursuit of the thieves. Myself and 2 others were the only ones who had lost no horses, and we were determined to have satisfaction. Let the consequences be ever fatal. End of quote. And there you go. Carson showing a little bit of a bloodlust. Consequently, the attack that followed saw he and his pards kill several of the warriors. How many, I do not know, but it was enough for Carson to at least feel somewhat satiated. More importantly, in his mind at least, it also served to dissuade any further such antics. Quote, we remained in our camp without further molestation until spring. End quote. This action would be repeated the following year down in present-day Utah, where Carson wintered with Anton Robideau and his bunch. When one of Robideau's native employees ran off with several of their horses, Carson volunteered to track the old boy down, which he did, alone, for over 100 miles. Killing the thief and returning the horses back to their rightful owners. Once again, this not only served as punitive, but also preventive. The message was clear. Any aggression, or sometimes even a perceived aggression, from the Native Americans would be met with swift, decisive, and brutal retribution. It worked when they ambushed those Apache down on the Gila, and it worked with the Crow back in 1832. This is something we'll be discussing much more in depth as the series progresses, but Kit's relationship with the indigenous was at worst callous and downright murderous, and at its best complicated. He would, at various times, live with the natives, trade with them, feast with them, fight alongside them against their enemies, and hell, Kit would even take a Native American bride. 2 of them, in fact. And when the Sand Creek Massacre went down in 1864, Carson would even go so far as to condemn Colonel Shivington as a dog, in part saying, "I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do, and when they are hostile, I fought them, hard as any man, but I never yet drew a bead on a squaw or a papoose, and I despise a man who would." End quote. And yet, with that in mind, one has to wonder how many women and children died during the forced walk of the Navajo. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Like I said, we will discuss this more later on as it directly affects Carson's legacy. But for now, suffice it to say, Kit's interactions with the indigenous was just a tad bit complex. And yeah, for around the next 12 years, this is pretty much what Carson's life consisted of. Just trapping beaver, exploring the West, and occasionally, or sometimes frequently, killing Native Americans. I thought about doing a play-by-play of everything Kit was involved in during his trapping years, but I just felt like it would be too repetitive. Mostly it was just him setting traps on such and such river, killing Blackfeet, and attending the annual rendezvous. If you're interested in such details, I'd highly suggest checking out Carson's autobiography, which is available online for free, linked down below in this episode's description. So yeah, instead of going that route, I thought it would just be best to highlight a few of Carson's most notable actions or experiences as a fur trapper. Like the time in February of 1835 when he was on the receiving end of a pretty severe gunshot wound. The Blackfeet had stolen several of their ponies, so Carson and a dozen others went looking to set things right. They caught up with the thieves about 50 miles down the trail, and rather than launch an assault, they tried a little diplomacy, essentially just asking the Blackfeet to pretty please return said horses. And this may have been at least partially due to the weather. According to Carson, it was not only freezing, but the snow was so deep they were routinely sinking into it up to their bellies. Also, the Blackfeet had them outnumbered 2-1. That wasn't something that normally slowed down the trappers, but I'm thinking maybe they didn't feel like pressing their luck in such harsh conditions. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but like I said, they chose to talk rather than fight. Didn't really work out that well, though. The Blackfeet would only agree to return 5 of the sorriest nags, and Kit Carson found this to be wholly unacceptable. Quote, "We broke for our arms and they for theirs, and the fight commenced. A man named Marquette and I were in the advance and overtook 2 Indians who remained in the rear of their party, concealed behind trees. I approached one and Marquette the other. Marquette was not paying sufficient attention to his Indian, who, I noticed, raised his gun to fire. I forgot entirely the danger in which I myself was in and neglected my Indian for Marquette's opponent. As the latter was about to fire on Marquette, I raised my gun and took sight. He saw me and endeavored to conceal himself, but he was too late. I fired and he fell. The moment I fired, I remembered the Indian that I was after. I looked and saw him sighting for my breast. As I could not load in time, I commenced dodging about as well I could. He fired and the ball grazed my neck and lodged in my shoulder." End quote. Seeing as how the trappers were unable to retrieve their horses, they instead opted to retreat and make a cold camp. To once again quote Carson, "We had no covering but our saddle blankets, and I passed a miserable night from the pain of the wound, it having bled freely and the blood having frozen." By the way, it wasn't only the Blackfeet who caused trouble for Carson during the year 1835. He was also obliged to take down a giant of a French Canadian that summer at the annual rendezvous. Now you may be asking yourself, what in the hell is a rendezvous? This is also something I've covered here on the Wild West Extravaganza more than once, but for any new listeners, basically the rendezvous was just a big gathering of fur trappers held in the mountains each summer. You see, in the past, they were forced to haul their pelts all the way to the settlements, either Taos or St. Louis, in order to sell them and re-up on supplies. This changed in 1825 when William Ashley brought said supplies straight to the mountains. He and the other traders would purchase all those hard-earned beaver pelts, and in turn, the fur trappers would then stock up on much-needed provisions, at a cost, of course. Despite the steep markup on goods, this arrangement mostly worked in the trappers' advantage, as they no longer needed to take months off each summer in order to travel back east. It wasn't all business, though. Once pelts were sold and supplies secured, the mountain men would then embark on a multi-week drunken orgy. And I'm only partially joking. These gatherings would become absolutely legendary due to their whiskey-fueled festivities. Drinking, gambling, fighting, and fornicating were the order of the day, and the trappers partook of it all in excess. Oh, and by the way, they were not alone. Various friendly tribes would also gather at the rendezvous, which, as it turns out, is how Carson met a beautiful Arapaho gal by the name of Singing Grass. But Kit wasn't the only one making eyes at young Singing Grass. She had also caught the attention of French-Canadian trapper Joseph Chenard. Known among his peers as the bully of the mountains, Chenard was once described by an English adventurer as being a quote-unquote stupid-looking man. Carson would later recall that he was very large and overbearing, mixed in a good deal of rendezvous whiskey, and is most likely that Chenard was damn near intolerable to be around. Now, this beef between him and Carson seems to have originated during a ceremonial dance where Singing Grass chose Carson out of all the other suitors to be her dancing partner. This enraged Chenard, and predictably he began hurling insults and obscenities at Singing Grass, a phenomenon that continues even to this day whenever a man's ego can't handle the slightest bit of rejection. Consider this yet another Wild West Extravaganza public service announcement. I don't think I've ever met a woman who didn't have at least a few stories about guys hitting on them, and when they politely decline to go on a date or exchange numbers or what have you, the guy will immediately go on the offensive and start insulting the girl. I've got a lot of flaws as a human being, but I can honestly say that this is something I've never understood. Guys, just move on. There are millions of beautiful women out there. I guarantee you that you are exactly what one of them is looking for. If a girl's not into you, she's just not into you. There's nothing you can do to change her mind. So the best course of action is just to quietly move on. No need to get rude about it. And apparently this is a lesson that Chenard had to learn the hard way. Per legend, Chenard even took things a step further and caught up with Singing Grass later on that night, alone, and tried having his way with her. But luckily she was able to escape. Now, as to how accurate that is, I can't say. I also don't know if Carson was aware of Chenard's attempted assault on Singing Grass. Fact of the matter is, Kit would never make mention of her whatsoever when sharing the story with his biographer. Here's what we do know. The following day, Chenard was still on a bender and stalking around camp trying to pick a fight with pretty much everybody he saw. Most of the trappers simply ignored him, so the bully of the mountains made his way over to Carson's camp, calling the Americans a bunch of mulling schoolboys and saying that he would take a switch to them. By this point, Carson had just flat out had enough. He'd later state, "I did not like such talk from any man, so I told him I was the worst American in camp." Kit then stood up and told Chenard that if he kept making threats, he, Kit, would rip his damn guts out. Now, to a casual observer there at the rendezvous, at least those who didn't know who Carson was, this must have been at least somewhat comical to witness. After all, Chenard was a giant, towering over his fellow mountain men, while Kit was, well, let's just say he was vertically challenged. A Colonel Edward Winecoop once described Carson as being 5'5" and 1/2 inches tall. But I've seen other descriptions stating that Carson was 5'4", another saying that he was 5'6", and at least one alleging that he was a mere 5 foot and 1 inches tall. The average height for men in the United States at this period was around 5'8", so whichever way you want to cut it, Carson was a little on the short side. Certainly doesn't seem to have suffered from little man syndrome, though. He was soft-spoken, rarely cursed, didn't drink much, and he absolutely despised the loudmouth bullies like Chenard. That being the case, I don't think anyone was surprised about what happened next. Both Carson and Chenard broke in search of weapons, and within minutes they were galloping toward one another at breakneck speed, like a pair of frontier jousters, screeching to a halt so close that the heads of their horses were touching. Words were then exchanged. We don't know what these words were, but I'm sure they weren't anything you'd want to repeat around your grandmother. Next thing you know, both Carson and Chenard raised their pistols simultaneously and fired, damn near at point-blank range. Chenard's ball grazed the left side of Carson's face, leaving a scar under his left ear that he'd bear for the rest of his life. As for Kit, his ball ripped through the larger man's hand and blew his thumb clean off. As Carson went for a second pistol, Chenard held up the maimed hand and began to beg for his life. Now here's the thing. This is a pretty famous duel. If you've read much about the mountain men, then you've probably, at some point, stumbled across an account of this fight between Carson and Chenard. I've read a few versions myself over the years, and the frustrating thing is, nobody knows how it ended. That part has somehow been lost to history. There's one story that claims that Kit did indeed pull the trigger on that second pistol, killing Chenard right there on the spot. That said, there's another story where Carson refrained, and then later on, Chouinard's wounded hand became infected and it was the gangrene that did him in. Carson himself would simply state that the camp had no more bother from the bully Frenchman. So make of that what you will. Now, full disclosure, although there are a ton of stories regarding Kit and Singing Grass first meeting there at the 1835 rendezvous, there's not a ton of evidence backing this up. Per historian David Roberts, quote, "The argument that Carson met Wayanib, aka Singing Grass, at the 1835 rendezvous hangs by a scholarly thread. Essentially, Captain Simpson's recollections as recorded by Sabin. There is no independent evidence, in fact, that any Arapahoes were camped by Horse Creek that summer." End quote. So while we don't know for sure exactly when they met, or if the stories of Chouinard trying to force himself on Singing Grass are even true, we do know that she and Carson would ultimately tie the knot sometime either in 1835 or 1836. Oddly enough, Kit would omit Singing Grass completely from his memoirs, and later confessed to Jesse Fremont that he was worried having a Native American wife would exclude him from so-called civilized society. Be that as it may, there's also evidence, scant though it may be, that the union between Carson and Singing Grass was happy. Kit would later say of her that she was a good wife to me. I never came in from hunting that she did not have warm water for my feet. And following her premature death in 1839, Kit would tell close confidants that he was remaining loyal to her memory. Also worth noting that it was a common practice for fur trappers to just abandon their indigenous wives and children whenever they got ready to move on. This would not be the case with Kit Carson. They had a daughter, Adeline, born in either 1837 or 1838, and yet another daughter around 1840, whose name, unfortunately, we do not know. And it was possibly after giving birth to this second child that Singing Grass developed a fever and passed away. To once again quote David Roberts in his book A Newer World, rather than abandon the couple's only surviving child, Adeline, Kit went out of his way to secure a stable life for her. End quote. Now more on Adeline in a bit, as well as the unnamed child and her tragic demise. But following that rendezvous of 1835, Carson simply went right on back to trapping beaver. I guess married or not, a man still got to earn a living, right? Kit worked his way along the Yellowstone and Bighorn rivers, wintered on the Snake, and come that spring, he and his companions visited Fort Hall before lighting out for the rendezvous of 1836. This was followed by Carson joining up with Fontenelle's brigade and once again trapping along the Yellowstone. Now, this was a fairly large group of trappers, numbering 100 strong. Guess they figured they didn't want to take a chance with the Blackfeet. Kit would specifically state that they were determined to trap beaver wherever they pleased, even if they needed to fight in order to do so. And like I said earlier, on and on it went. They would trap such and such river during the spring, spend the winter with a friendly band of natives, and then head to the rendezvous each summer. Rinse and repeat. The only constant, other than the beaver, were the numerous violent encounters with the Blackfeet. Now, if you ever listened to the series I did on Jim Bridger, you might recall that he led a large contingent of trappers, Kit Carson included, up to the Three Forks region in present-day Montana. And while they were there, they began encountering an altogether different sort of Indian sign than they were used to. The smallpox had recently wreaked havoc on the Blackfeet, and the trappers began witnessing the after effects. Just random lodge after lodge containing nothing but the dead and dying. Still, though, when the brigade stumbled upon the main Blackfeet camp, they felt inclined to attack. Remember, these two groups, the Blackfeet and the American fur trappers, were avowed enemies. Numbers are elusive, but as late as 1837, it's thought that somewhere between 40 to 50 trappers were killed annually by the Blackfeet. And you better believe that the mountain men tried to avenge their pards any chance they got. In this particular case, however, Brigade Leader Jim Bridger refused to sign off on the attack. Okay, fine. But his men were free trappers, and thus not obligated nor conditioned to asking for permission. They pretty much did as they pleased, including Carson. According to Kit, quote, "We were determined to try our strength to discover who had the best right to the country. We soon reached the village, attacked it, and killed 10 Indians, taking several scalps." End of quote. The Blackfeet rallied, though, and chased Carson and the others straight back to Bridger's camp. The battle would rage on for a few more hours until the trappers charged the Blackfeet and went what they called muzzle to muzzle, forcing a retreat. And the same exact thing damn near went down just a few days later when they stumbled on yet another Blackfeet village, this one containing just 15 lodges. As the trappers prepared their assault, they were met with the camp's skeletal thin and disease-ravaged residents. And finally, at long last, mercy was shown. Despite the ugly history between the Blackfeet and the trappers, they chose to trade rather than fight, at least on this particular occasion. I wish I could say things remained peaceful, but this uneasy truce was extremely short-lived, and the wholesale slaughter between the mountain men and the Blackfeet would resume in the weeks that followed. That said, the smallpox was absolutely devastating to the Blackfeet, and they were estimated to have lost around 2/3 of their population. As such, their domination of prime beaver country was greatly diminished. But then again, let's face it, at that point, so were the beaver. According to Carson biographer Hampton Sides, the beaver trade was seriously on the wane, in part because of the panic. He's referring here to the economic depression of 1837, and in part because of the vicissitudes of high fashion. In an inexplicable turn, silk hats had replaced beaver hats as objects of patrician desire in the cities of the East and all across Europe. And in truth, there weren't many beaver left. The fur companies had been so successful in penetrating the western rivers that the beaver population had been pushed to the brink of extinction. Eastern markets were drying up, the summer rendezvous grew smaller and drearier each year. The mountain men, through skillful persistence, were the agents of their own demise, having depleted the very resource that had enriched them. Like most of the trappers, however, Carson seemed only dimly aware of his own role in the phenomenon. Beaver was growing scarce, was all he said on the subject in his memoirs, adding, "It became necessary to try our hand at something else." End quote. And I think that is a good spot to go ahead and wrap things up for today. Don't worry, we've got a lot more on Kit Carson coming your way next week in part 2 of this series. Till then, do me a favor. If this episode has brought any value to you, if you learned a little something or maybe even found yourself entertained and you like to support independent storytellers, feel free to buy me a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/Wild West. Link down below. That's buymeacoffee.com/Wild West. Your support is not only appreciated, but it really does help to keep the show going. Also, if you're looking for more true tales from the Wild and Woolly West, head on over to wildwestextra.com. And while you're there, hit that contact button. Let me know what's on your mind. Or you can just email me directly at josh@wildwestextra.com. Till next week, adios.